There's a moment so many people over 60 know, even if they've never said it out loud. You're sitting in a room full of people who love you. A doctor's office, a family dinner, a checkout line, and somehow the conversation happens around you instead of with you. Someone leans toward your daughter and asks, "How's she doing?" While you're sitting right there, fully present, fully capable of answering for yourself. You smile. You let it go. But something in your chest tightens, just a little, not because of that one moment, but because it's happened before, more than once, more than you've admitted, maybe even to yourself. This is a video about that tightening, about the quiet, creeping sense that somewhere along the way, without any single dramatic event, you became a little harder to see. And if you're here, you already know exactly the feeling I mean. Today, we're going to walk through why this happens, not as an accident, not as something wrong with you, but as the predictable result of forces most people never name out loud. We'll look at how culture stopped designing itself around you, how roles you once held quietly disappeared, how even the people who love you most got pulled into lives that move too fast to notice you the way they used to. And then, importantly, we're going to talk about what you can actually do about it. Not by chasing the world's attention back, but by understanding a truth most people discover far too late. Being seen was never really about how many eyes were on you in the first place. Stay with me. This one might feel like it was written just for you. So let's start with reason number 1, because it's the most visible of all the invisible forces. The world around you didn't just drift away from you. Somebody built it that way on purpose, for reasons that have nothing to do with your worth. Think about the last few things you watched or scrolled through, a show, a commercial, a feed of any kind. How many of the main characters, the faces smiling back at you, were people who looked like they'd lived as long as you have? How many products, how many storylines, how many jokes were built with you in mind, rather than around you as an afterthought, a punchline, or a problem to be managed? Here's what's actually happening behind that, and it's worth understanding clearly, because clarity is what turns a vague ache into something you can actually set down. For decades, the advertising and entertainment industries have chased one particular slice of the population, roughly 18 to 49 years old, because of an old assumption that younger audiences are still forming their brand loyalties and are therefore more valuable to capture early. It doesn't matter that people over 60 often have more disposable income, more free time, and more loyalty to the brands and shows they already love. The industry built its entire machine around chasing the young, and once a machine like that is running, it rarely stops to ask if its assumptions are still true. So stories get written about first jobs, first loves, first apartments. Storylines about people building a life get made 1,000 times over, while storylines about people who have already built one, who are living inside the wisdom of having done it, get treated as a niche market at best and invisible at worst. Even social media, which feels so personal, runs on algorithms that reward speed, trends, and constant novelty. Habits that came naturally to a generation that grew up inside these platforms, and far less naturally to a generation that didn't. So even your own feed can end up feeling like a party being thrown in a house you weren't quite invited into, even though you're standing right there in the room. Here's the part that matters most, though. Human beings partly measure their own belonging by how often the culture around them reflects their face back at them. It's not vanity, it's wiring. When you see people like you living full, complicated, interesting lives on screen, some part of your brain quietly registers, "I still belong here." And when that reflection disappears, when show after show, ad after ad, story after story quietly skips over you, your brain doesn't rationally conclude, this is simply a marketing decision based on demographic spending patterns. It emotionally concludes something much rougher. Maybe I don't belong here anymore. That conclusion is false. But it doesn't feel false when it's happening to you, day after day, one skipped reflection at a time. Look at the specific ways this shows up once you start noticing. Birthday cards for someone turning 70 are far more likely to make a joke about forgetfulness or fragility than to genuinely celebrate 7 decades of a life fully lived. Movies still cast older actors, certainly, but watch the roles closely. How often are they the wise mentor who exists purely to help a younger character grow, rather than the center of their own unfolding story with wants and contradictions of their own? Even the word senior, attached to discounts and menus and parking spaces, quietly frames an entire stage of life as a category to be accommodated, rather than a life still actively being lived. It's worth remembering, too, that this wasn't always how things worked. In many cultures, and for most of human history, age was treated as the very thing that earned a person their place at the center of the room, not the edge of it. Elders were the ones consulted first, not last. What you're experiencing isn't some timeless, universal truth about growing older. It's a fairly recent cultural invention, driven largely by which age group happens to be easiest to sell things to, and inventions like that can be seen clearly for what they are and then set down. That's not evidence that you've become less relevant. That's an industry choosing which age bracket to chase for advertising dollars, and it says nothing true about who you actually are. Once you see it this clearly, the silence around you stops sounding like a verdict and starts sounding like static noise from a system that was never built to include your reflection in the first place. You are not absent from the culture because you stopped matching. You are absent because an entire industry, for purely commercial reasons, stopped pointing its cameras your way. That's a fact about the industry. It was never a fact about you. Reason number 2 follows naturally from the first, but it hits closer to home because this one isn't about a distant industry, it's about your own daily life and a role you may have held for 30, 40, even 50 years. Have you ever woken up on an ordinary Tuesday with absolutely nowhere you have to be? No meeting waiting on your opinion. No one calling to ask how you'd handle a tricky situation at work. No badge to swipe. No desk that's yours. No inbox with your name attached to decisions that matter to other people. For a lot of people, that empty Tuesday feels less like freedom and more like a kind of quiet that has weight to it. For most of your working life, your identity was reinforced constantly, almost invisibly, through the structure of your days. You were the person who handles this. You were the one whose opinion got asked in the meeting, whose signature meant something, whose experience got leaned on when things got complicated. That role gave you a kind of visibility that didn't require you to fight for it. It was built into the architecture of your daily life. People needed you, and needing someone is one of the most reliable ways a person gets seen. Then retirement arrives, sometimes by choice, sometimes not, and almost overnight that entire architecture disappears. The meetings stop. The calls stop. The daily proof that you were needed, useful, consulted, gone, not gradually but almost all at once. And what's left in its place is a version of your life where nobody is required to ask your opinion about anything, which can feel, in the quiet moments, disturbingly close to nobody wanting your opinion about anything. But here's what that mistakes for truth. Retirement didn't remove your knowledge. It didn't erase 40 years of judgment, pattern recognition, and hard-won wisdom about how people and situations actually work. It removed the stage, the specific set of daily rituals that used to broadcast your value to everyone around you automatically. The actor didn't disappear when the curtain came down. Only the audience stopped showing up on a schedule. That's an enormous difference, even though it rarely feels like one in the first few quiet months, or even years after the working world stops calling. Think about how many small, specific rituals used to confirm your value without you ever having to ask for confirmation. A younger colleague stopping by your desk to ask how you'd handle a difficult client. Being the name people put forward when something needed to be done right, not just done fast. The quiet satisfaction of mentoring someone through a problem you'd already solved 20 years earlier, watching them light up when your advice actually worked. Those weren't small things, even though they probably felt ordinary while they were happening. They were dozens of tiny, daily confirmations that your years of experience were still actively useful to someone. Retirement doesn't send you a farewell letter explaining that all of that stops now. It just stops, the way a tap stops the instant you turn the handle, with no gradual fade to soften the transition. And in that sudden quiet, it's easy to mistake the absence of those rituals for the absence of the value they used to confirm, as though the well itself ran dry, rather than simply the pipe that used to carry water from it. That's not you disappearing. That's the stage disappearing while you're still standing exactly where you always were. The badge was never the source of your value, it was only ever a signal that pointed toward it. And a signal going dark doesn't mean the thing it was pointing to went dark too. You are still the person who knows how to handle difficult things. That didn't retire. Only the meetings did. It's worth noticing, too, how much of that old structure also gave shape to your time, not just your sense of being needed. A career fills the calendar automatically, whether you love the work or merely tolerate it. Mornings have a reason. Afternoons have a purpose. The week has a rhythm that doesn't require you to invent it from nothing. When that structure disappears, what's often mistaken for depression or aimlessness is sometimes something simpler and more solvable. An unstructured stretch of time that nobody handed you a new architecture for. The feeling of being unseen and the feeling of having unstructured days often arrive together and get tangled up as though they're the same problem. They aren't. One is about how others perceive you. The other is simply about how your days are organized. Untangling them matters because the second one, unlike the first, is almost entirely within your own hands to redesign. Reason number 3 moves from the loss of a role to something even more personal, the way people started talking near you instead of talking with you. Picture a doctor's office. You're the patient. The appointment is about you, your body, your questions. And yet, at some point, the doctor turns slightly and starts speaking to whoever came with you. How's she been feeling lately? Any changes we should know about? You're sitting right there. You can hear perfectly well. You have plenty to say. But somehow, the question skipped over you entirely, as if you'd already left the room. This happens more often than most people over 60 are comfortable admitting, and it happens in family settings just as much as medical ones, at dinner tables, in stores, at family gatherings where someone discusses your plans, your health, your preferences with someone else, as though you're a subject to be managed rather than a person to be consulted. Here's the uncomfortable truth about why. It usually isn't cruelty. It's a shortcut. Somewhere in our culture, a quiet, largely unconscious assumption has taken root that once someone reaches a certain age, they might not hear as clearly, might not follow as quickly, might need things simplified or handled on their behalf. Most people carrying that assumption would be mortified to hear it said out loud. They don't think of themselves as dismissive. They think of themselves as helpful. But the effect on the receiving end is the same regardless of the intention behind it. You are present, capable, and fully able to answer for yourself, and the conversation happens as though you're not. This particular kind of invisibility cuts differently than simply being ignored, because being ignored is passive. Nobody's paying attention to you at all. This is active. Someone is right there, engaging, asking questions, showing care, just not to you. It's a strange, specific kind of loneliness. Surrounded, included in the room, and still somehow left out of the conversation about your own life. And because it usually comes from people who love you, it's hard to name it without sounding ungrateful, so most people swallow it instead, smile, let the moment pass, and quietly file it away with all the others just like it. Consider what this does over time, moment stacked on moment. Each individual instance is survivable, even forgettable on its own. But the body keeps a kind of quiet tally that the mind doesn't always consciously track, and after the 100th small moment of being spoken about rather than spoken to, something starts to shift in how you show up in rooms. You might start answering more briefly, out of a half-formed expectation that the fuller answer would get redirected elsewhere anyway. You might stop volunteering information you'd once have offered freely, waiting instead to be asked directly, which of course only happens less often the longer you wait. This isn't you becoming quieter by nature. It's a learned adjustment to a pattern that trained you, gradually and without anyone intending it, to expect less airtime than you actually deserve. It isn't only doctors' offices either, once you start paying attention. It's the bank teller who slides the form toward the person standing next to you instead of you. It's the customer service call where someone suddenly starts speaking slower and louder, as if volume were the problem, when you'd said nothing at all to suggest you hadn't heard perfectly well the first time. It's a well-meaning relative who starts finishing your sentences before you've reached the point, convinced they're being helpful by saving you the trouble of speaking for yourself. Each instance on its own looks small enough to brush off, and that's exactly what makes the pattern so hard to point to. No single moment is dramatic enough to justify saying something, so it accumulates instead, quietly, moment after moment, until it starts to feel less like a series of small oversights and more like a verdict everyone else seems to have quietly agreed on without ever consulting you. That's not you losing your voice. That's someone else, without realizing it, forgetting to use their ears. The fix, when it comes, is often smaller than it seems, answering directly even when the question wasn't technically asked to you, gently pulling the conversation back toward yourself without apology. But we'll get to that. For now, it's enough to simply name what's happening, because naming it correctly is the first thing that makes it stop feeling like your fault. Reason number 4 has less to do with how people treat you, and everything to do with a quieter, harder truth. At some point, without any single dramatic event, your circle of people got smaller. Have you noticed how much shorter the list has gotten? The people you'd actually call if something wonderful or terrible happened tonight. Not the people who'd send a card. The people who'd actually pick up the phone at 11 at night. If you're honest, that list has probably changed shape over the years, and not always for reasons you chose. This is one of the least talked about realities of getting older, and it deserves to be said plainly. Friendships and social circles thin out naturally over a long life, not because you failed at friendship, but because life itself keeps subtracting from the equation. People move to be near their grandchildren. People develop health conditions that keep them closer to home. And some people, the hardest loss of all, simply aren't here anymore. On top of that natural attrition, there's a second, quieter force at work. For most of your adult life, your social world was manufactured for you automatically, by structures you didn't even have to think about. The workplace put you in a room with the same people day after day, and friendships grew out of that proximity almost by accident. Your children's school events put you next to other parents. Committees, teams, carpools, all of it generated social contact as a side effect of simply living your life. Once those structures fall away, whether through retirement, an empty nest, or simply time, the automatic supply of new social contact falls away with them. Nothing replaces it by default. You have to build it on purpose now, which is a very different task than simply showing up somewhere it used to happen for you. There's actually something researchers have observed about this stage of life that runs counter to how frightening it feels. As people sense that time is more limited, many naturally start preferring fewer, deeper relationships over a wide circle of casual ones. That's not decline. That's a kind of wisdom the earlier decades of your life didn't have room for. But even a wise narrowing can feel, on a quiet Tuesday evening with no calls coming in, indistinguishable from simply being left behind. There's also a physical dimension to this that rarely gets said plainly. Driving at night might not feel as easy as it once did. A friend who used to live 10 minutes away might now be an hour's drive, in a different town near their own children. A body that used to carry you anywhere without a second thought might now ask for more planning, more rest, more consideration before a visit that used to be spontaneous. None of that is a medical verdict on your capability. It's simply the accumulation of small frictions that, together, make maintaining a wide social circle require far more deliberate effort than it ever did when everyone lived within walking distance and nobody needed to think twice about a car ride. Understanding that the friction is largely logistical, rather than personal, changes how the quiet weekends feel. It's not that people stopped wanting to see you. It's that seeing you now takes more coordination than it used to, and coordination, unlike affection, has a way of quietly losing out to the busyness of ordinary life. That's not you failing at friendship. That's the machinery that used to make friendship automatic quietly switching off, while nobody thought to warn you it would. The ache is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than talked out of. But it's worth holding on to this. A smaller circle built on decades of trust is not a lesser thing than a wide circle of new acquaintances. It's a different kind of wealth. It just doesn't announce itself the way a full calendar used to. Reason number 5 brings this even closer to home, because now we're talking about the people who, more than almost anyone else, are supposed to make you feel seen, your own children. You know the feeling. The phone doesn't ring quite as often as it used to. When it does, the call is shorter, a little more rushed, punctuated by a child crying in the background or a "sorry, I've got to run," before you've even finished your sentence. You're not imagining it. Something did change. And it's fair to feel the sting of that, even while loving them completely. Here's what's actually happening on their end, even if they'd never think to explain it to you this clearly. Your grown children are very likely living through one of the most stretched, overloaded stretches of adult life. Raising their own kids, managing careers that demand more than a 40-hour week, carrying financial pressures that didn't exist in quite the same shape when you were their age. Researchers sometimes call this the sandwich generation. Adults squeezed between caring for their own children and caring for aging parents, with almost nothing left over for themselves, let alone for long, unhurried phone calls. That squeeze doesn't mean their love for you has diminished. It means their available bandwidth has been divided in ways that have nothing to do with how much you matter to them. Love and attention feel like the same thing from the outside, but they aren't. A person can love you with their whole heart while genuinely having almost no time left in a given week to prove it the way you'd like them to. There's also a strange, quiet mirror happening here, if you look for it. You very likely lived through this exact same season yourself, decades ago. Stretched thin by young children, a demanding job, a mortgage, a marriage, barely able to call your own parents as often as you meant to, even though you love them completely. If you can remember that season honestly, you already understand, from the inside, exactly what your children are living through right now. That doesn't erase the loneliness of fewer calls. But it does mean the silence isn't a message about your worth. It's an echo of a stage of life you once stood in yourself. It's worth being honest, too, about how differently this can land depending on distance. A daughter 3 hours away by car experiences the squeeze differently than a son who moved across the country for work, and neither version is a smaller kind of love than the other, even though the phone rings at very different rates. Some families manage a weekly call like clockwork. Others go months between real conversations, not from any lack of caring, but because nobody built the habit early enough for it to survive the chaos of raising young children while working full-time. If your family falls into the second category, that's not a verdict on the relationship. It's simply a habit that never got built, which means it's also a habit that can still be built now, later than you'd like, but not too late to matter. There's a particular kind of guilt tangled up in this, and it runs in both directions, even if nobody says it out loud. You may feel guilty for wanting more of your children's time, worried that wanting it makes you a burden rather than a parent who simply misses them. And on their end, your children very likely carry their own quiet guilt every time they hang up the phone faster than they meant to, every time a visit gets postponed for the third time, every time they catch themselves thinking, I really should call more, in the middle of a day that's already full past the edges. Grandchildren, ironically, can make this even more complicated. They're often the reason your children have so little time left over, and yet they're also the bridge that eventually brings families back together. At birthdays, holidays, the ordinary Sunday afternoons that slowly return once the youngest years of parenting start to ease. The distance rarely stays exactly this wide forever. It tends to be a season, even when it's a long one. That's not love running out. That's love competing with a life that has too many places to be at once, the same way yours once did. If there's an ache here, let it be an honest one rather than a bitter one. The distance is circumstantial, not emotional. And circumstances, unlike feelings, tend to shift again with time. Grandchildren grow older, careers stabilize, the sandwich generation eventually comes out the other side. Now, before we go further, I want to pause here with you for a moment, because everything we've covered so far has been heavy, and it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. If even one of these 5 reasons landed somewhere true for you, you are not alone in this, not even close. This exact feeling is sitting quietly inside millions of people your age, right now, in living rooms very much like yours. But here's why I asked you to stay with me. Everything up to this point has been about forces outside of you: culture, industry, retirement, the mathematics of a long life, the overloaded schedules of the people you raised. None of it was ever a verdict on who you are. And in the second half of what we're covering today, something important shifts. We move from why this happens to what it does inside you when it happens for long enough, and then to what you can actually do to feel seen again, starting far sooner than you might expect. So stay with me a little longer. The most important part is still ahead. I also want to say this plainly because it deserves to be said outright rather than left implied. None of what you've felt in any of these 5 situations makes you difficult, oversensitive, or ungrateful for noticing it. Plenty of people carry these exact feelings for years without ever hearing them named out loud, which only makes the feelings heavier, because unnamed things have a way of turning into private shame instead of shared, ordinary experience. You are not alone in any of this, and you are not wrong for feeling it. Let's keep going. Reason number 6 picks up right where that pause left off, and it's one of the strangest forms of invisibility because nobody involved ever meant to cause it. Have you ever found out about a family gathering, a milestone, or even a piece of news about your own grandchildren days after it happened, because it had already been shared, discussed, and celebrated somewhere you weren't part of? Not because anyone excluded you on purpose, because the conversation simply happened in a place you weren't in the room for. That place, more often than not, is a screen. Over the last couple of decades, an enormous share of ordinary daily connection, the small updates, the photos, the inside jokes, the look what she just did moments, has migrated onto platforms and apps that weren't designed with people who didn't grow up using them in mind. That's not a statement about your intelligence or your capability. It's a design problem, not a you problem. These tools were built by young people, for young people, tested on young people, and then handed to everyone else afterward, with the assumption baked in that anyone could simply figure it out. Some people did easily. Others found the interfaces confusing, the notifications overwhelming, the whole experience more effort than it was worth for what felt like a small reward. And once you stop opening an app, the world on the other side of it doesn't pause to wait for you. It just keeps moving, keeps posting, keeps sharing, entirely unaware that an entire relationship's worth of small moments is now happening somewhere you can't see. Here's the part almost nobody says out loud. The exclusion itself isn't personal, but the loneliness it creates absolutely is. Nobody sat down and decided to leave you out of the family photo thread. And yet the effect from where you're sitting can feel exactly like being left out, because in the moments that matter, you weren't there and nobody thought to bring you in. Both things are true at once. No malice and real hurt. That combination is precisely what makes this form of invisibility so disorienting. There's no one to be angry at, just a door that quietly moved to a different wall while you weren't looking. And it isn't only that the tools are unfamiliar, it's that they rarely stay still long enough to be mastered once and trusted afterward. The app that finally made sense last year has a new layout this year. The password rules keep changing. A single wrong tap can feel like it might break something important, and asking for help too many times can start to feel embarrassing, especially when the person explaining it sighs, or talks a little too quickly, or takes the phone out of your hands to just do it themselves, rather than walking you through it patiently. That kind of help, however well-intentioned, teaches the opposite of what it means to. It quietly confirms the fear that you can't handle it, instead of proving that you can, given the same patient explanation anyone would need for something genuinely new. None of that reflects your actual capacity to learn. It reflects how rarely anyone takes the time to teach it properly, and how quickly frustration on both sides gets mistaken for a lack of ability. That's not you being left behind. That's a world redesigning its rooms faster than anyone thought to build you a proper door into them. The good news, and it is genuinely good news, is that this particular gap is one of the more fixable ones on this entire list. It rarely requires becoming a different person or mastering something complicated. Usually it requires learning one or two specific doors, with someone patient enough to walk you through them once. We'll come back to that. For now, just know this one isn't a life sentence. It's a skills gap, and skills gaps close. Reason number 7 is the one I most want you to sit with carefully, because this is where everything we've discussed so far stops happening around you and starts happening inside you. Have you ever caught yourself, mid-sentence, deciding not to share an opinion in a group? Not because you didn't have one, but because some quiet voice in the back of your mind said, "They're probably not that interested in what I think anyway"? Have you ever stopped mentioning an accomplishment, a memory, a piece of hard-won wisdom, before anyone even had the chance to respond to it, simply because you'd already decided the response wouldn't be worth much? This is the turning point, and it deserves to be named honestly. After enough repeated experiences of being spoken about instead of to, of being left out of conversations that happened without you, of watching a phone stay quiet that used to ring, the mind does something it thinks is protective. It starts lowering expectations in advance, so the disappointment never has to land as hard. You stop raising your hand before anyone gets the chance to overlook it. You stop telling the story before anyone gets the chance to seem uninterested. On the surface, this looks like humility, or simply not wanting to be a bother. Underneath, it's something closer to a bruise the mind is trying to protect from being hit again. This is, without exaggeration, the most dangerous stage of everything we've discussed today. Not because the outside world got any quieter, but because you started confirming its silence yourself before anyone even had the chance to. The invisibility stopped being something that happened to you. It became something you started performing quietly on your own, out of a kind of self-protection that made sense at the time but cost you dearly over the long run. This shift shows up in ways so small they're easy to miss entirely. Deciding not to go to the gathering because it's probably mostly younger people anyway. Letting an opportunity to share a story pass by, assuming it's already been heard, or wouldn't land the way it once might have. Even posture can start to reflect it, sitting a little further back in the room, taking up a little less space in the conversation, as if some part of you has already agreed to a smaller role before anyone asked you to play one. It's worth naming plainly that this isn't weakness, and it isn't decline. It's closer to what happens to anyone, at any age, after enough repeated experiences of being overlooked. The mind adapts to protect itself from disappointment, the same way a hand that's been burned learns to move faster away from heat, whether or not the next surface is actually hot. The adaptation made sense as a defense. The trouble is that defenses built to protect us often end up costing us more than the thing they were protecting us from ever did. Eleanor Roosevelt once said something worth sitting with for a long moment here. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. It's a hard sentence to hear at first, because it can sound like it's placing blame on you for feeling unseen. It isn't. What it's actually pointing at is something quietly freeing. Every single force we've talked about today, the industries, the empty calendar, the doctor's office, the family group chat, all of it happened to you entirely outside of your control. But the final step, the step where you start believing that silence is the truth about your worth, is the one place in this whole chain where you still hold the pen. Nobody can hand you that belief. You can only hand it to yourself. And what one hand gives, the same hand can also take back. That's not the truth about your worth. That's a wound talking, dressed up as common sense, and wounds, however old, are never the same thing as facts. If you recognized yourself anywhere in this one, please hear this clearly. Catching it is not a small thing. Most people never catch it at all. They simply live inside that lowered expectation for years, mistaking it for realism. You just named it. That alone is the doorway starting to open. There's a difference worth drawing out here between accepting a feeling and accepting it as fact. You're allowed to feel the sting of being overlooked without agreeing that the sting is telling you the truth. A smoke alarm going off doesn't always mean there's a fire. Sometimes it just means the batteries are old and the sensor's gotten oversensitive from years of use. The feeling of being invisible is real and worth taking seriously as a feeling. But feelings, however persistent, aren't always accurate reporters of reality. And this one, built from years of outside forces that had nothing to do with your actual worth, has earned the right to be questioned rather than simply obeyed. Reason number 8, the last one, is really less of a reason and more of a return, because this is where we finally turn from why you felt unseen toward what being seen actually requires, now at this exact stage of your life. Picture a room, not a crowd, not an audience, not a packed house full of strangers glancing your way, just one person, a grandchild, a neighbor, an old friend, genuinely listening to you, asking a real question, waiting for your real answer instead of already thinking about their own reply. How does that feel, compared to the earlier image of a doctor's office where the question skipped past you entirely? Here is the reframe that changes everything, and it's worth hearing slowly. Being seen was never actually about the size of the audience. That was always a young person's definition of visibility. Applause, attention, a crowded room turning toward you all at once. But real visibility, the kind that actually nourishes a person, has always been about depth rather than volume. One person who truly listens carries more weight than 100 people who glance and move on. At this stage of your life, you don't need the whole cultural machine to turn back around and notice you. You need a small number of real, attentive connections where your presence is undeniable. And that is a far more achievable and far more meaningful goal than trying to win back a spotlight that was never really warm to begin with. This doesn't mean lowering your expectations. It means finally measuring visibility with an accurate ruler instead of the wrong one you were handed by a culture obsessed with crowds. In practice, this looks smaller and more human than people expect. Reaching out to one person this week instead of waiting for the phone to ring. Answering a question directly, warmly, even when it was technically asked to someone standing beside you. Telling the story before anyone has to pull it out of you, because the story is worth telling on its own merits, not because of who's watching. Learning the one app, the one video call button, the one small door into the room where the family conversation is actually happening now. None of these require you to become louder, younger, or different than you are. They simply require you to stop waiting to be found and start gently showing up. There's another shift worth naming here, quieter than the practical steps, but just as important. So much of feeling unseen comes from waiting to be asked, waiting to be included, waiting for someone else to open the door first. But you carry something almost nobody younger than you carries yet. Decades of lived experience that took real time to earn and can't be shortcut by anyone still in the middle of earning theirs. That's not a consolation prize. That's an asset, and assets are meant to be used, not stored away out of politeness. Offering it doesn't require a stage or an audience. It can look like asking your grandchild genuinely curious questions about their world instead of waiting to be asked about yours, becoming the one who listens well enough that people seek you out for exactly that reason. It can look like writing down a story before it's lost, so that being seen doesn't depend entirely on being in the room when the conversation happens. Visibility at this stage of life has less to do with being noticed and much more to do with staying genuinely engaged. Curious, present, still reaching toward people, rather than only waiting for people to reach toward you. That's not settling for less. That's finally choosing the kind of visibility that was always going to be more real than the version the world sold you first. Do you remember the moment we opened with, sitting in that room, that appointment, that dinner table while someone else answered for you? Here's what changes now, and it changes starting today, not someday. The next time it happens, you'll have language for exactly what's going on, and more importantly, you'll have permission to simply answer for yourself, gently, without apology, the moment the question lands anywhere near you. Not because the world suddenly remembered to look your way again. It may take its time getting there, if it ever fully does. But because you stopped waiting for permission to be the one who speaks for your own life. That shift, small as it sounds, is the entire difference between spending the years ahead feeling like a supporting character in a story other people are telling, and spending them as exactly what you've always been. The person who has lived the most, understood the most, and still has the most worth saying, whether the room remembers to ask or not. None of the 8 reasons we walked through today were ever proof that something is wrong with you. A culture that chases the young for profit. A career that ended without warning the daily rituals that used to confirm your worth. Well-meaning people who default to speaking around you instead of to you. A social circle thinned by time, distance, and simple attrition. Children stretched thin by lives every bit as demanding as the one you once lived at their age. A world that moved its conversations behind screens you weren't handed a proper key to. And, hardest of all, a mind that started believing the silence was true, simply because it had heard it so many times. Every single one of those forces came from outside of you. Not one of them was ever a fair measurement of who you actually are, how much you still have to offer, or how deeply worth knowing you remain, right now, exactly as you are. Whatever room you find yourself in this evening, quiet or full, familiar or new, you don't have to earn your place in it anymore. You already have. The only thing left is deciding, gently and on your own terms, to stop waiting for the room to remember that first. If this found you at the right moment, I'd love for you to stay a while longer here at Elderly Light. This channel exists for exactly this reason, for the conversations, the reflections, the quiet truths that so much of the world moves past too quickly to notice. Subscribing simply means you won't miss the next one, and honestly, it means a little more than that too. It means you'll have found one more room, even a small digital one, where someone built the whole conversation with you in mind. Thank you for spending this time with me today. You were seen here. I hope you carry a little of that with you into the rest of your week.